Well, in Acts 27, Luke, the author, utilizes a literary device, a story within a story. Of course, we're going to be back in Acts 27 today, even as we were last week. He writes a real-life inner story that highlights figurative and psychological features in a real-life outer story, the entire Bible. In other words, the micro-narrative in Acts 27 accents many of the themes of God's macro-narrative told throughout the Old Testament and New Testament scriptures. And these two stories interact. The events of the Acts 27 inner story are useful in shedding light on the Genesis to Revelation outer story. And the events in the Genesis to Revelation outer story are also useful in shedding light on the Acts 27 inner story. We see this a lot within the scriptures. So accordingly, God uses a supplemental mini-story to help advance his overarching grand narrative, much like he does with David and Goliath or other stories within the scriptures. So what do these two inner and outer stories have in common? Both stories are about how our great God, against all cosmic odds and forces, sovereignly and ironically brings to pass a great salvation. Now, if you weren't with us last week, we went through Acts 27 in a survey. And there are many different nautical terms and different kind of concepts that aren't readily understandable in Acts 27. And I'm just going to read it this morning because we spent the entire time last week looking at those details. If you'd like to know them and you'd like to know the foundation of what I'm going to say today, then you can go out on the website and get that message. So we're going to start this morning just by reading the story, all 44 verses. In Acts 27, 1 through 44. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia. We came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing from Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. And since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail for Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's dinghy or boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So there's the dramatic story. And again, we went through that in quite a little bit of detail. I think you'd benefit if you have time to go back and look at some of the detail we covered last week, if you get a chance. Well, I want to start this morning with an implicatory proposition. And I say it's an implicatory proposition because I'm not going to prove to you that this is the way to interpret this passage, except by going through my entire message. By the time you get done, I think you'll see there's very good reason from the Scripture to look at this passage in this way as we begin to think, how does this story work itself out in the life of the church? So here's my implicatory proposition. Acts 27 is a portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church, painted with the brush of a dramatic story. Acts 27 is a portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church, painted with the brush of a dramatic story. This is a very artful story that God has used to paint a portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church. And I want to just start off with a real general look. We only have one message, so I'm going to give you all the features of this story that I found within it, so that you can first look at the portrait, as it were, from a distance and see all of the features. And then toward the end, I'm going to pick some select features and I just concentrate on those because there are some that are more important than others. Well, what's the feature? What are some of the features of this portrait as we look at this generally? A portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church. Think about the story. Consider this. It's an interactive drama involving the Creator, the creatures, and the created order. Even angels. The Creator, the created order, and all kinds of things, men as well as things. It's a difficult mission to the ends of the earth amid contrary, unrelenting winds at sea. There's a favorable wind that briefly results in some smooth sailing. It's a dangerous mission to the ends of the earth that includes a pounding, violent storm at sea. It's a recapitulation of Jesus' ironic, cross-shaped story in the ministries of his commissioned apostles and disciples. It's a ship of 276 diverse people, Jew and Gentile, from a variety of different backgrounds. It's a trek involving many geographic places and diverse cultures. So it's a portrait, again, of the missional dynamics of the last days church painted with the brush of a dramatic story. There's a man of God who gives an unheeded warning born of a seasoned ministerial experience. Remember, Paul had been on the Mediterranean many times. He gives an unheeded warning. It was born of seasoned ministerial experience, but it's unheeded. Other dynamics. It's a mission punctuated by wave after wave of overwhelming fear, futile desperation, and dark discouragement. There are 3 major waves in Acts 27 of those things. It's a world-saving assignment. They've been commissioned, of course, that's executed by believers who are both afflicted and assisted. There's an acute loss of hope in all self-saving efforts and resources. There's a man of God's timely encouragement. Take heart. Born of his own vital and seasoned faith. When Paul encourages the people, it's born right up out of the health of his own faith. He thinks it's going to turn out exactly as he's been told. It's a timely encouragement that he tells them to take heart. There's a call to faith in the true God's revealed word by God's man. You need to believe it too. And he called them to that at that point of his encouragement. There's a predetermined salvation outcome rooted in God's revealed word that was both comforting and daunting. There's a man of God's stern warning regarding deserters who endangered the salvation of others. Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. A man of God's ongoing admonitions aimed at helping others persevere in the way of a promised salvation. He's like a shepherd with sheep. He's keeping this whole ship intact, encouraging them, warning them, doing different things. It's ongoing admonitions and counsel to help them to persevere in the way of a promised salvation. There's a series of internal struggles beget by selfishness that seriously threaten the welfare of all. There's a mystifying concurrence of God's unquestionable sovereignty and man's indisputable responsibility. There's an encouraging breaking of bread with prayer and thanksgiving led by a man of God so all could gain strength amid the draining challenges. And finally, a dramatic great salvation wherein all aboard barely but safely survive. So you can see these dynamics. They're dynamics of the last days church. So again, Acts 27 is a portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church painted with the brush of a dramatic story. And it is a portrait that looks both backward and forward. This is interesting. This is the advantage if you've been in this church for a while. Why do we look at things more in a line than a circle? We look at the story part of the scriptures first, and then the more systematic theology parts after that. It's a portrait that looks both backward and forward, and if you follow it as a story, you'll begin to see. I went back and read the entire book of Acts, and what I discovered was, looking backward, this recapitulates the earlier warfare storyline in the book of Acts. This is what it kind of felt like if you were an apostle from Acts 1 forward, up to Acts 27. So it looks back and recapitulates in a dramatic story the earlier warfare storyline in the book of Acts. And looking forward, it forecasts the missional warfare of the last days church, including what the church militant experiences today. And my guess would be that your experiences have also overlapped it. That if this was a movie, you would probably watch it a lot because it's a narrative that you would relate to if you're a believer that's been dead serious about ministry and have borne the cross for any length of time. Well, those things said, let's look at some of the prominent features of this portrait and take a deeper look. So now we've backed off from the general look of the portrait. We're going to move in on it and look at the most prominent features that are within it so that we can understand it even deeper yet. Start with the dynamic, a difficult mission to the ends of the earth amid contrary, unrelenting winds at sea. The word sea occurs 8 times in Acts 27. And for the Jews, the sea was a monster. Even though they would have acknowledged that the sea was part of God's original good creation, like in places like Psalm 146, that it was his and that it did his bidding. I believe it was mentioned in Psalm 95 when we read it in our call to worship. But the sea was regularly seen as a dark force, a power in its own right, and a place from which dark powers might emerge. The Exodus was marked by Yahweh's astonishing parting of the sea, and later celebrated as his victory in battle over a monster in Psalm 93. When Daniel saw his great central vision describing the history of God's people in terms of wicked world empires rising up against them and eventually being overthrown, he talks of 4 monstrous beasts coming up out of the sea. In the last days, including now, the sea still carries the signs and the memories of the battles of old. This is something deep within the Jewish culture at the time. And we'll see that it should be still deep in our culture as we look at a revelation that we have. Now, Paul would have acknowledged that all these monstrous enemies were ultimately defeated by Jesus the Messiah. These beasts and the dragon and all they were ultimately defeated by what happened with Jesus and the Messiah and the cross. However, he would have acknowledged that the sea was still potentially a great threat. Remember, this is an already, not yet scheme. God didn't conquer everything all at the same time. He does it, he's going to do it in 2 installments. So the sea still is a potential threat, probably in Paul's mind. And later we know for sure that in the Apostle John's writing, he would reflect this ongoing threat from the sea. If you'd read through Revelation 12 and through the first part of 13, you would see there's still a beast that comes up out of the sea. There are still floodwaters that come upon the church. If you look in Revelation 21, there's some no mores, like no more pain, no more grief. And one of those no mores is no more sea. And that's not to be understood to be literal. The sea will probably get reconfigured just like the heavens and the earth. There'll be no more sea that comes up with these contrary winds and these storms for the people of God. It's used figuratively in Revelation 12. One day, to be sure, the sea will roar out of its deep joy along with the songs of the trees and fields when Yahweh comes to set the earth right forever. See that in Psalm 96 or 98. With the very sea creatures themselves joining in the song of celebration, Psalm 148. So the creation's still good, but the sea took on this connotation of this dark force early in Jewish history on purpose so that God could write through his servants this apocalyptic literature and to convey something to us. So in the meantime, believers, including us, must face the trials and turbulence that continue to rise up out of this ancient, monstrous, figurative foe, the sea. This is what Paul and his companions faced as they sought to carry out God's purposes in Rome. Violent cosmic opposition via the sea, literally and figuratively, rose up to thwart the missionary cause of the gospel. In other words, Paul didn't carry out his commission without going through fire and water. The first is a metaphor and the second as a fact. Nor will we. There will be this fire and then there's going to be this water. And so this story helps us to understand that in a dramatic and colorful way. And Luke's account here is also, by design, in stark contrast to the account of Jonah the prophet. We're going to look at all the stories of the Bible and bring them in. It's an Old Testament story also involving someone that was a man of God, though unfaithful. Jonah was an unfaithful man of God. And the sea, and a ship, and a storm, and a sea monster. Both men were called to speak for God, but Paul did not abdicate like Jonah. Paul did not run away. He was being faithful to his calling to preach in the great imperial capital. Remember, the imperial capital at the time of Jonah was Nineveh. But he was unfaithful and wouldn't go there. Paul's going to Rome. He's nothing like Jonah. This is Luke's message. Paul did not fall asleep in the ship's hold, and he certainly did not get thrown overboard for being unfaithful. So Luke has Jonah in mind. He's bringing that in. He wants to make sure you know this is what faithfulness looks like, even as unfaithfulness looked like what it did with Jonah. Well, there's these winds at sea. So not just the sea, but the winds at sea. Remember we said these were the Etesian winds that came up annually. They were northeasterly on our map. And they came up over and over again in Acts 27 and in a variety of ways, We sailed with difficulty. The winds were against us. Every time we turn around, they're going by these islands and using these lees, which is a protective shelter, using the land as a windbreak. These winds are constant and relentless. These Etesian winds. These sea winds are contrary and unrelenting, just like the emerging dark invisible forces that are vigorously opposing these missionary workers en route to Rome and us too. Constant opposing contrary winds that'll wear you down. So that's what the sea winds have to do with. Well, another dynamic we'll explore some more of as we zero in a little closer on this portrait is there was a favorable wind that briefly resulted in some smooth sailing. Remember that? The south wind blew gently. And clearly the south wind blowing gently in verse 13 was the exception, not the rule, in Paul's missionary endeavor. And that's likely characteristic of our ministry experiences also. So long as we're devout, so long as we're dedicated to it, doing it on God's terms, it might blow gently if you abandon the cross as the way that you advance ministry. There's ways to get things to go smooth, but not if you do it faithfully. So there's a favorable wind that briefly results in some smooth sailing, but it was the exception. It certainly wasn't the rule. Well, there was also a dangerous mission to the ends of the earth that included a pounding, violent storm at sea. It wasn't just the winds that were contrary. There was an occasion of what we said was a Medicane, a Mediterranean hurricane. A Medicane that was a circular, whirling storm that moved northeast, or from the north and east, and spread to the south and to the west. They faced that pounding, violent storm, again, at sea. This sea storm is more than contrary and challenging. It was pounding and violent, just like the emerging dark invisible forces that are violently opposing these missionary workers on their way to Rome, and us too. Think back to the book of Acts, how everything's going well and they're preaching and people are believing and all that kind of stuff, and pretty soon there's a martyrdom. Then there's a spreading out, and the church moves to Judea and Samaria, and ultimately, after another storm, to the ends of the earth. So we see that in the book of Acts. We will see it in our own ministries also. There'll be contrary winds that are unrelenting, that'll wear you down, but there'll be also sea storms where the beast comes up out of the sea and hits harder, pounding, maybe even violent, maybe even ended up in the death of some and the ruin of others. So it's a dangerous mission to the ends of the earth that includes a pounding, violent storm at sea. Well, another feature that's also prominent, we'll spend some time on this one, is a recapitulation of Jesus' ironic cross-shaped story in the ministries of his commissioned apostles and disciples. A recapitulation. So their ministries look like his. And I want to spend some time here because it's one of the main places where you'd say, this is why you would interpret this the way you would. You have to understand that the book of Acts was written by Luke, and it is the second volume of a unified two-volume work. Luke's first volume, the Gospel according to Luke, is about all the things Jesus began to do and teach. That's from Acts 1:1. And Luke's second volume, the book of Acts, is about what Jesus continued to do and teach. The book's usually called the Acts of the Apostles, but it really shouldn't be called that, because it's what Jesus began to do and teach in Luke, and what he continued to do and teach in Acts. But he's exalted. He's the Son of Man at the right hand as he does these things, pouring out the Spirit and the new temple and all these different things. We have to understand that this is a two-part story. Luke and Acts go together. They belong together. And they're artfully, the two volumes are deliberately interlaced with rich literary parallels and thematic patterns. If you don't look at them as a story, one, or if you don't look at them as a set, you won't see this. But they are interlaced with rich literary parallels and thematic patterns. Accordingly, the story in Acts is in many ways a recapitulation of the themes and patterns of the gospel story in Luke. What happens in the life and ministry of Jesus is thematically repeated in the life and ministries of the apostles and the early New Testament believers. Let me give you an example, maybe the most prominent parallel. For example, Jesus went on a journey and eventually arrived in Jerusalem, and so did Paul. Jesus was picked up by the Jewish authorities and handed over to the Romans. So was Paul. Jesus was interrogated by the Roman governor, who at one point brought him before Herod Antipas. Paul was interrogated by 2 Roman governors and brought before Herod Agrippa, and so on. So there's these parallels, and there's even parallels within the parallels. So Luke says Jesus resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. Acts 21 says Paul did the same thing, even against the advice of those who were being moved by the Spirit. Same with Jesus. The Spirit was on him. Resolutely set his face to Jerusalem. So did Paul. These are the kind of parallels that Luke works into his literature in these 2 stories. Accordingly, Jesus' crucifixion corresponds to Paul's shipwreck in Luke's narrative structure. And both are dark, raging, spiritually charged storms. Jesus' storm come up out of the sea. Contrary winds in a storm. Even the earth itself at that time became dark, just like it did in Paul's shipwreck. Both are dark, raging, spiritually charged storms. So there's a thematic parallel between Luke 23 and Luke's volume 1 and Acts 27 and Luke's volume 2. Now what's in Luke 23? Because most of you probably don't know what the outline is. Listen how it parallels and recapitulates. Jesus before Pilate, Jesus before Herod. Pilate delivers Jesus to be crucified, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus, and Jesus is buried. That's Luke 23. Mirrors Acts 27. So this is how I get to this place where you say this is a snapshot of the dynamics of the last days church in terms of how the ministry goes. Luke is asking us to watch as the story unfolds, to see the Acts 27 narrative, as it were, superimposed on the story of the cross. Now, if Luke was a modern guy, I think this is what he might do as an artist, okay? First, he'd get one piece of paper, real nice paper, and he would go have Luke 23 printed on it in a gray that was light enough that you couldn't, it wasn't prominent, but that you could still see it. And then he would take Acts 27 and he would print that in black ink right on the same paper. So it's superimposed. Luke 23, Acts 27, one on top of the other. That's what might be one of the things he would do if he artistic in a modern day setting. Accordingly, Luke's short story is a sign of the way the unique event of Jesus' death is implemented in the mission of the church to the world as it yearns for its new creation. This is what his intent was. And the psychology of the cross is woven into the very texture of Luke's Acts 27 narrative. All I have to do is appeal to what Jeff's been doing in 2 Corinthians. Go to 2 Corinthians, it even mentions it, that he was adrift at sea, he was shipwrecked 3 times. Clearly cross language. And it's everywhere in 2 Corinthians. And this is the psychology of the cross that's woven into the very texture of Luke's Acts 27 narrative. He's in danger. In danger for a lot of different reasons, just like it says in 2 Corinthians. Think about it. Paul is innocent. He's been through all kinds of appeals. No one's ever had any charge that stuck to him. But he has been repeatedly persecuted and imprisoned. Although weak and ignoble, I mean, he's a prisoner on the ship. He has no say. No one listens to him up front. Why would they? He's a prisoner. He ends up powerfully in charge of the entire ship and its crew at the end. Paul is faithful. Nonetheless, he's afflicted with yet another life-threatening shipwreck experience. This is the pattern of apostolic life, both in Paul himself and in his message. Paul's hardships were a loving reenactment of Jesus' suffering and death for others. So this is how the gospel works out. Through taking on the cosmic forces of evil, which do the best they can to Jesus' followers and servants as they struggle ahead in obedience to their vocation. It's interesting that when Paul would counsel Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, he's talking about several different things. And some of them are apostates that he's mentioning. I think it's Alexander and Hymenaeus or something like that. And he refers to them. He says, Timothy, now fight the good war. He uses warfare language. And then he says, but there are some who have been shipwrecked in their faith. Among them are Alexander and Hymenaeus. There seems to be something of an evidence that he had this kind of stuff in mind. They had gone shipwreck into apostasy. So this is part of their vocation, and it was to be passed on even to Timothy. When the people of Jesus follow the way of Jesus, their stories will begin to look like his story, which is both beautiful and costly. The church, like the little ship in Luke's story, is violently storm-tossed. The raging storms and precarious dangers do not mean that the journey is futile. They merely mean that Jesus is claiming the world as his own, and the powers of the world will do their best to resist him. So as the ministry moves forward, and it does it so on Christ's terms, then this activates all the beasts of the sea, so to speak. And that's why there's more opposition. Of course, Paul had incredible amounts of it. Those who are caught up in the middle of it all must recognize the mark of the cross for what it is and claim the victory already won in the unique events of Calvary. This is part of understanding what's going on here. Is understand the beast and the dragon, the false prophet, the counterfeit trinity of the book of Revelation has already been defeated. Yet there's mop-up operations. There's the already, there's the not yet. And knowing that that's already been conquered. I mean, how many soldiers go to war and know they're going to win? We know we're going to win. And so this is part of the psychology that should activate us, and that's one of the reasons why Paul persevered. Well, another dynamic. It was a mission punctuated by wave after wave of overwhelming fear, futile desperation, and dark discouragement. This is kind of a paraphrase of how the story went as far as I looked at these three waves that are in the book of, or in Acts 27. At first, things were difficult and challenging. The winds were against us. Then they became frightful and draining. They're going to crash into the rocks. They haven't eaten for a long time. It's just wearing them down. Finally, they became violent and life-threatening. Those are the three waves, as it often is for believers today, too. Some in our own church have gotten some of that recently. These are the kinds of things that will mark the people of God. Wave after wave of overwhelming fear, futile desperation, and dark discouragement. One other dynamic of the last days church that's in Acts 27 is that there's a world-saving assignment executed by believers who are both afflicted and assisted. You know, that confusing thing where God is doing things and it seems like sometimes, can we just bypass all the difficult things and get right to the answers? It's as though God afflicts his servants with his left hand and then assists them with his right hand. It's rather confusing, but this, again, is his way. It's the way of the cross. So that, for instance, Paul's weather warning is rejected. Couldn't that have just saved everybody a lot of time and energy if they would have just listened to that? But later, he providentially assumes leadership of the entire ship and has an opportunity for ministry. So God's afflicting with one hand and he's assisting with the other hand. And this is one of the dynamics in Acts 27 and in the last days church. Well, there's also an acute loss of hope in all saving efforts and resources. There's something about that verse in verse 20, I believe it is. It says in verse 20, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Not a few Christians have come to that before they've become a Christian. And we see that. They had come to the place where they didn't think they were going to survive. All aboard eventually abandoned any hope they had previously placed in themselves, the ship, the sailors, the gear, the dinghy, even the wheat was thrown overboard. They didn't trust their abilities and their skills as sailors anymore. They thought they were gone. God evacuated the hope out of that ship on purpose in order that he could establish hope through the Apostle Paul. They abandoned any hope. All saving efforts and resources were abandoned. All self-saving efforts and resources. Well, yet another one. There's a predetermined salvation outcome rooted in God's revealed word that was both comforting and daunting. We dealt with this some last week. Remember in verse 22, yet now I urge you, take heart. It's part of it, Paul's encouragement. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now, if you were on a cruise liner and that's what the captain told you, wouldn't you have mixed feelings about that? That's good. But what's it going to be like to, see the ship destroyed? Especially because there wasn't any dinghy. Remember, the soldiers cut it away. There was nothing. Take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Well, we have something similar, don't we? We too have a promised, sure salvation, coupled to the realities of a very challenging voyage at seas. And through many tribulations, you're going to enter the kingdom of God. Acts 14. This is part of the encouragement that Paul gave in Acts 14. Through many tribulations, you'll enter the kingdom of God. Because we too have a very challenging voyage at sea. Well, another one of the dynamics, as we look at this portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church, there was a series of internal struggles beget by selfishness that seriously threatened the welfare of all. Let me just give those to you. The serious risk that the unwise leaders imposed upon the passengers and crew when they attempted to navigate to the preferred harbor. Remember Phoenix? They knew better. Paul knew they knew better. They assumed that risk, and they jeopardized the welfare of all when they did that. The sailors who, pretending to lay out anchors, attempted to escape from the ship via the dinghy. They were thinking of themselves. They're going to get away and jeopardize the welfare of all. And in the end, the soldiers who planned to kill all the prisoners to ensure their own personal peace. They didn't want anything to do with Roman justice. So we have these series of internal struggles beget by selfishness that seriously threatened the welfare of all. And of course, that's our experience of the church. If you've lived it at any time, there's selfishness that pops up, that works on churches, destroys them, threatens them, sometimes threatens the salvation of others because they desert themselves. Well, one more, and then we'll get to the conclusion for the last one. But there was a mystifying concurrence of God's unquestionable sovereignty and man's indisputable responsibility. We actually spent some pretty good time on this last time because it's so dominant within the passage. I wanted to make sure that it got in there in several different ways. But there's a mystifying concurrence of God's unquestionable sovereignty and man's indisputable responsibility. And this is important again to see the story. Earlier in the book of Acts, we're informed that Jesus died because it was central to God's plan, even though the people who brought about his death carried the responsibility for one of the most wicked actions ever. So we see this, that it was by God's determined foreknowledge that the plan unfolded, but they did it by godless hands. There's occasions of this in two sermons, in Acts 2 and then in Acts 3. And then there's a prayer meeting. And the people are praying, and they're praying about how all these different leaders and all these forces of the world opposed God, and yet it was by his plan that all this came together through the Jews and the Gentiles and all the different leaders. And that's why the cross happened, because of the predetermined foreknowledge of God, and yet it was their godless hands that did it. Man's sovereign, and they were responsible for what they did. So there's a prayer meeting, two instances with preaching, one in a prayer meeting, and then there's evangelism in Acts 13, where the Jews would not listen, and they continued to be hard-hearted. And then the apostles and the leaders moved to the Gentiles and told them they condemned themselves by not listening. So we see that there was a precedent within Acts before this even comes up. And this concurrent tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility is also reflected in Acts 27. Unless these men stay in the ship, they can't be saved. On the other hand, not a hair of your head will perish. There's a dance going on here about this concurrent tension in Acts 27. What's interesting is in Acts 27, the account involves two encouragements and one admonition. So here in the book of Acts, we have two accounts of preaching, one of prayer, one of evangelism, two encouragements, and one admonition, all with this dance of this God's sovereign, man's responsible thing going on. And in light of this, as we look at this as a story, I think it's important to kind of turn maybe from the more mechanical and theological to something else. The answer to the puzzle of divine sovereignty and human responsibility in this story is not to be found merely in an abstract, impersonal formula. So it should go beyond our, very heady Reformed ways of being able to explain it in a theological and mechanical way to where it actually has a flesh and blood representation in our life, just like it did in the Apostle Paul. And Jesus' flesh and Jesus' blood, that's how we're supposed to act out on faith on this. And in our flesh and in our blood. Because we live real lives with other people. And it's a living and experienced and felt thing to live this doctrine out. In the book of Acts, it is a flesh and blood reality, too, rooted in cruciformity. Isn't that interesting? That the cross is also central to it, and it's informing this concurrence, this dance of concurrence. And it impacted every ministerial event the believers experienced, whether that was collectively or individually. So the same will be true also with us. It is a vital tension that we too must ever and always act on by faith, just like Paul did in Acts 27. Well, by way of conclusion, again, Acts 27 is a portrait of the missional dynamics of the last days church painted with the brush of a dramatic story. And I'm going to look at one last prominent feature of this portrait as we conclude our deeper look. And that's this dynamic, this missional dynamic in the last days church, as well as Acts 27. A dramatic great salvation wherein all aboard barely but safely survive. As the Acts 27 story draws to an end, a salvation motif clearly becomes front and center. All hope of being saved was lost. Verse 20. If the sailors had carried out their secret plan to slip away in the ship's dinghy, none of them could be, quote, saved. The loss of this lifeboat meant that all 276 passengers are exactly the same. Each one will have to go through the water to reach the shore. Now they're equals. All of them are going to have to go through the water, the troubled water, to reach the shore. All are told that taking some food involving the breaking of bread will give you strength. Or it could be translated, or for your health. Verse 34. What's interesting about that is the phrase, give you strength for your health. This phrase includes a word translated elsewhere in the New Testament as deliverance or salvation. There's only one salvation according to Acts 4. There's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Same word for health or strength. And verse 34 regarding the taking of the breaking of bread. The centurion wished to, quote, save Paul. Verse 43. And the end result was all were brought safely to land. Verse 44. And the words brought safely are derived from a word that connotes a thorough or utter salvation. So this is how you know that if you're artful in story writing, the conclusion's very important. There's a sense in which the conclusion ought to be like, I remember reading in Robert Dabney, it's like when you hammer a nail. You hammer it 3, 4, 5 times. On the last occasion, you seat it. You seat that, and that's what a conclusion should be. It's exactly what Luke does. Luke could hardly make it clearer. The meaning of saved in a far, far deeper sense corresponds to Luke's larger intention throughout this chapter. The way of salvation is through the cross and through the waters. We've been crucified with Christ, buried with him in baptism, through the waters to safety. That's the Noah story, the Exodus story, the John the Baptist story, the Jesus story, the Paul story, our story. The story of how our great God, against all cosmic odds and forces, sovereignly and ironically brings to pass a great salvation. Let us pray. Our Father and God, we thank you for this passage and this encouragement. We thank you for the artful way the Spirit moved Luke to write it. We ask that you would help us to digest it, sit on it for a while, soak it up, contemplate our union with this Christ and this salvation, and ask that you would help us to be sanctified through it, to have greater faith and greater hope and greater love. We thank you for an opportunity to sit in front of it in freedom. And we thank you for the opportunity to contemplate it this deeply. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, at this time we'll take the morning offering.